He is hereby acquitted of the charges in said articles.
Donald Trump at an approval high after the impeachment trial. But what does a strengthened Trump presidency mean for America and the rest of the world? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Victory on the impeachment hoax. That was how Donald Trump reacted to the end of his Senate trial. The US president was charged with abusing power by pressuring Ukraine to investigate a political rival, then obstructing a congressional investigation. But neither articles of impeachment received enough votes to remove Trump from office. Stock markets in Asia and Europe rose after the acquittal, and Trump's approval rating is at a record high of 49%, according to Gallup. The Democrats are vowing to maintain pressure on the president, as Heidi Jo Castro reports from Washington, D.C.
It is therefore
the outcome was as expected.
said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby acquitted of the charges in said articles.
Donald Trump, only the third U.S. president to be impeached, now also the third U.S. president to be acquitted. The White House called it full vindication and exoneration.
Mr. Romney.
All but one Republican senator voted not guilty on both articles of impeachment. The lone defector was Mitt Romney, the Utah senator who in 2012 was the Republican presidential nominee.
My faith is at the heart of who I am.
Romney said in an emotional floor speech his conscience was more important than party loyalty. He voted guilty on abuse of power.
What he did was not perfect. No, it was a flagrant assault on our electoral rights, our national security, and our fundamental values.
A few other Republicans said they believed what Trump did was wrong, but didn't rise to removal from office. Others blasted the Democrats' efforts to remove the 45th U.S. president.
I worry about the future of the presidency after what's happened here. Ladies and gentlemen, you will come to regret this whole process.
All Democrats voted to convict Trump on both charges. They voiced disappointment after his acquittal, but did not admit defeat. Trump may yet face further investigations in the Democrat-controlled House.
And make no mistake about it, the drip, drip, drip of evidence is going to keep coming out with each new revelation.
The message to the House of Representatives, don't do this again.
Now with the impeachment officially behind him, Trump can spring toward the November election. Whether all this has helped him or hurt him as a candidate is the big question. Heidi Jo Castro, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's bring our guests into the show then. We have joining us from New York, Sahar Aziz, Professor of Law and Director of the Center on Security, Race and Civil Rights at Rutgers University in New Jersey. In Atlanta, Jason Stanley, Professor of Philosophy at Yale University and author of How Fascism Works. And in Brussels, Theresa Fallon, Director of the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Jason. Jason, do you think it's undeniable at this point that the impeachment process has backfired on the Democrats? It's left Donald Trump strengthened and emboldened rather than battered and weakened?
Impeachment is always a political process, but I think there was a moral demand here for impeachment, and the Democrats had to do it regardless of the effect. So I'm not sure that backfiring is the way.
But if it's left him with the highest approval ratings of 49%, according to Gallup, that's him strengthened, isn't it?
I don't think that one should think about impeachment necessarily in those terms. And also his State of the Union address, which was right out of the history books, was no doubt responsible for part of that bump in his approval rating. I wouldn't put that all on the impeachment process.
Mm-hmm. All right. Sahar, has it demonstrated basically Donald Trump's ownership of the Republican Party and of the political initiative for now?
Well, first I want to just comment about the backfiring question. I agree that it has not backfired on the Democrats for a few reasons. The first, it showed to the Democratic voters and to the independents that the Democrats are not weak, they won't be bullied by Trump, and that they do have a backbone, because that's been a criticism of them by their supporters. And second, it exposed Trump for what many people already knew, is that he's a cheater. And so even though he didn't get removed by the Senate for political reasons, because the Democrats couldn't get the 2/3 vote and couldn't get 20 Republicans to switch parties, but he did get impeached, and he's only the third president in U.S. history to get impeached.
Again, Sahar, I hate to harp upon this point, but there may be undeniably some people in the U.S. who see it like that. But if his approval rating has risen, you know, again, you have to wonder, do all Americans or even the majority of Americans see him as being exposed or see him as being vindicated?
But 35 to 42% of independents supported removing him, based from December to now. Those 35 to 42% may act on that desire to remove him by going to the polls, which would be a huge advantage to the Democrats, because ultimately, with the polarization of the American public, it's really the independents that are going to call the shots. So I think that this is generally a win for the Democrats. But to answer your question about the Republican Party, what's been quite fascinating and somewhat disturbing is the way in which Trump has been able to scare so many moderate Republicans who have revealed behind the scenes or have leaked information that they think he did abuse his office, and that he's had a history in his last 3 years of being a very untraditional, if not outright abusive president in terms of his exercising his legal rights. But these moderate Republicans are afraid of being kicked out of office, because Trump is very open in threatening people that he will remove them if they are not 100% loyal. So it has been a remarkable expression of loyalty, probably out of fear for Trump.
All right, let me broaden it, since we don't have too many supporters of the US president right now here on this panel. Let's broaden it perhaps to the global perspective and bring in Theresa. From a global perspective, the world looking into this, does the world have to basically calculate going forward, saying this is a Trump presidency that is in a stronger position for now going into US elections? And you've got to make your global calculations on that basis now.
Well, I think 9 months is a very long time in U.S. politics, but I think many Europeans have perceived that Trump would be reelected. It's too early to say, and we have the biggest black swan of all with the coronavirus and how that will impact the global economy. Because at the end of the day, in the U.S., the domestic politics will trump everything. And if their pocketbooks are suffering, the public might opt for a different candidate.
Theresa, we've seen, I'm glad you mentioned the economy, for example, we've seen stock markets, global stock markets, rise after Trump was acquitted. Is this a sign that at least part of the world economy is saying this stability or clarity, at least at this point, is good? The acquittal is good for the world economy?
Well, I think the markets have spoken. I mean, it's clear, there's clarity now, but I think that this kind of bump might not last. I think it just is a post-impeach. Everything's clarified now, and it's a bump, especially after the State of the Union. But I don't think it will last. So we really have to watch and see. I think the whole markets have been extremely jittery because of the coronavirus issue, and we've seen, demand destruction in the oil sector that was unprecedented. So I think that it's just kind of relief.
Jason, I want to pick up on something which Theresa mentioned there, that the Europeans, at least some of them, had already calculated that there might be there will be a Trump win in the next elections. How important a development from a global perspective is the emergence of Donald Trump from this impeachment trial, acquitted and with an apparently high rate of approval? How important a development is that in global affairs?
It's a strong sign that authoritarianism is popular, that authoritarianism works, that in the world's oldest democracy, you can get a large number of supporters to resonate with an authoritarian message of ignoring democratic institutions, of engaging in corrupt practices. You can get senators and prominent politicians in the world's oldest democracy to line up behind a corrupt leader if they show strength and if they show the kind of consistency to, as Theresa said, to punish opposing voices. It shows that this works, and that's a strong message to authoritarians like Modi and Bolsonaro and others, and Orban across the globe right now.
Sahar, you, of course, part of your job description is precisely to focus on some of the issues of civil rights and rule of law. Are you concerned about where things are heading in terms of constitutional tradition and democratic practice in the US as a result of where impeachment has left the US?
Absolutely, and I'm not alone. There was a letter that was issued to the Senate by hundreds of U.S. legal academics expressing their serious concern with the way in which Trump has abused the power of the presidency and degraded its legitimacy. And this is not a partisan issue, at least within the legal academy, because when you use your office to tell a foreign government to sabotage the election of your primary opposition, that is cheating. It's mainstay standard authoritarian practices is a form of corrupting the elections. But with regard to the Middle East, which is an area that I study, Trump has been a boon for Middle East authoritarians, whether it's President Sisi in Egypt, whether it's Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, and many others who have always had pressure from the U.S. to be more democratic, to preserve human rights, to try to instill rule of law. But what Trump has done is given them the green light and said, it's okay if you jail your people, kill your people, do what you did with the Khashoggi and the Saudi embassy in Turkey, and you slice people up, which is the most barbaric of all acts. And so what Trump is saying is, you and I are the same. I will protect your authoritarian practices. And at the same time, he is engaging in a very slow and dangerous erosion of U.S. constitutional law and U.S. traditions. And so the real test is going to be the elections in November. And it's also going to be, I think, a failure for the Republican Party, because as we saw with the House elections, the House switched from being Republican to Democrat as a result of the first 2 years of Trump. And I think the Senate may switch. And if the Senate doesn't switch, I think Trump has a very serious uphill battle in retaining the presidency.
All right. Let me try and play devil's advocate here and point out, of course, Republican supporters of the U.S. president would disagree with much of that and say, he has been cleared of these charges because there wasn't really enough evidence that he'd done something to rise to the level of impeachment. And I'm sure they would counter and say, he's spoken out against instances like the killing of the Saudi journalist Khashoggi. However, Theresa, from a global perspective, looking from outside in again, does the world of authoritarianism believe that? Or does the world of authoritarianism and the fight against democracy see a different message in what has happened with the impeachment trial?
Well, there's clearly a democracy deficit going on throughout the world. Even here in Europe, we see problems now in Poland, Hungary. This idea of a liberal democracy is taking root. So it's not a good time anywhere really in the world right now. And the US used to be the country, the shining city on the hill. And when people look to it, they don't really see that any longer. But there is some evidence that the Trump administration is kind of learning
Theresa?
on the job. We've seen, it's hard to say because we see that Donald Trump clearly feels far more comfortable with authoritarians. He gets along with them far better than with democratically elected leaders, strangely. So it's difficult to really understand what that means. It's the first time a U.S. president has actually been against the EU. So we see these kind of international institutions that were established after the war based on the ashes of the war. So the whole liberal international order seems to be eroding, and I don't think Donald Trump is helping it. He's more of a symptom than a cause, but I think he's kind of contributing to increased weakness of the system. In the meantime, China is using this advantage while Donald Trump administration pulls away from a lot of these international institutions. The Chinese kind of are pushing their way in. We've seen that especially with the United Nations. So, like they say in Hong Kong, water, be like water and go everywhere. So the Chinese are using this kind of U.S. Distraction that they're not really working with all these international institutions as a way for them to increase their presence there. And we see that the Trump administration is finally waking up to this, because just recently they've appointed a special envoy to the UN to try to claw back the lost influence that the U.S. has there now.
That's a really interesting thought. Okay, go ahead, Jason. I was going to come to you anyway.
Now, when we talk about, has this helped the economy? Does this help Trump? We really are obscuring democratic values. Maybe democracy is on the wane. Maybe democracy will lose. Maybe Plato is right and people prefer a strong leader and democracy is too hard and too messy. And capital likes authoritarianism. Capital doesn't like the messiness of international regulations. Capital doesn't like labor movements. But when we focus on whether this helps the market, whether this helps people on the sort of race to the election and the power elements, we miss what's fundamental about democracy. What's fundamental about democracy is its moral authority. And that was what was important about impeachment. It doesn't matter if it hindered the economy. It doesn't matter if it hinders people's chances for the elections. It was vital for this to happen, for our democratic institutions to say they were still awake.
But do you think that's the message? Let me take that point back to Theresa then. Do you think that's the message that the world will read into this impeachment process and say, yeah, the moral authority stood up here? Or will the world say, look, this is an impeachment process that's ended. Donald Trump is in a stronger position. Elections are not that far away. Should the world be preparing for more of a US push towards unilateralism, undermining of multilateral action, of work through the UN, and all those things that you were talking about, Theresa?
Yes, I mean, I really do think we have to be concerned about a post-values world. And we're seeing this. I mean, we've seen, for example, Angela Merkel and Macron go to Beijing and sign deals, even though they know what's going on in Xinjiang or protests in Hong Kong. It doesn't matter. It seems that everyone is kind of adopting this kind of post-values world. I think that we're headed for a very serious problem right now, and we see that money trumps everything. So I think that Ai Weiwei, a Chinese artist, recently commented that why is the UK embracing Huawei, for example, when they know their values? So this idea of this kind of great power competition between the US and China, what we're really missing is that strong moral compass that the US had during the Cold War. It doesn't really have it now under a leader like Donald Trump. So I think this could be problematic.
That's very fascinating, the idea we're hearing from both of our guests in Atlanta and Brussels of the push towards, or the move towards, the post-value, I like that term, the post-value world. Sahar in New York, your research has covered from times civil rights outside and democracy outside of the US. From the Arab Spring to the Palestinian issue, are we entering a world guided less by the concepts of civil rights, human rights, and democracy?
Well, the Middle East has unfortunately not experienced a democratic wave. They attempted through the Arab Spring, but I think most analysts will agree that it was a general failure, unlike arguably what happened in Eastern Europe post-Cold War. However, the U.S. influence or the U.S. commitment to human rights, at least rhetorically and at least officially, mitigated many of the authoritarian practices in the region. It at least created some red lines as to what authoritarians could do. And now there are no red lines. And so what you're seeing is an aggravation of human rights violations, an emboldenment of many of these dictators, which in the long run is going to create more instability. There are a number of analysts, including myself, who think that
will be the lesson
inevitable that you will have
regimes will draw from the end of this impeachment process and how it ended with such high approval ratings for the US president. The idea that you guys were talking about earlier, that, hey, the moral compass has still been somehow successful in standing up. That's not going to be the message that dictators around the world take away from this, right?
No, I think you're correct. They'll see Trump as much as more powerful, and they will trust him more in being able to keep his promises that they won't hold them accountable. However, the smarter ones are going to know that there is a possibility that Trump will be elected out of office, and so they might have a wait and see perspective. And also, the Senate might flip. There is a chance. The Republicans are barely holding on to the Senate by just 4 votes or 3 votes.
Okay, Jason, briefly, and then before we go to Theresa, because I see you all wanted to get a word in on this.
So it's not clear that democracy is upheld by being more popular than its alternative, authoritarianism. What we're seeing is what political philosophers have said since Plato, that people like a strong leader. Authoritarians know that. Stability doesn't necessarily go together with democracy. The forces of capital might be behind authoritarianism everywhere. The Wall Street Journal endorsed Bolsonaro. Nevertheless, democratic forces must persist regardless of its popularity, regardless of what people think, because of the moral authority of the central concepts of democracy, of the rule of law.
Okay, Theresa.
Well, there is one kind of lone voice in this desert right now. We saw Mitt Romney bravely speak up for, values and morals. So he's one of the just him and Susan Collins were the only people who, but actually Romney's speech, I think, might anoint him as the next Republican leader, because after this whole Trump saga ends, I think we should try to maybe gauge that the American public might, in their common sense, embrace values once again.
Do you really think, though, Theresa, the rest of the world is going to be counting on that? Very briefly, yes or no, Theresa?
No, but I think it's important that at least one person stood up, and one voice at least. But I mean, we've seen with the whole narrative of the end of history, right, that liberal democracy, everything was going to be fine. But it hasn't really worked out that way. And we've seen authoritarian rulers Trump, grow in power, democracies in decline. And I think the biggest concern right now is what's going on with China. So especially an authoritarian regime. How will the U.S. be able to confront this? It won't just be able to confront it economically, because China has a massive economy. The U.S. economy is still larger. But if they lose their moral high ground, it will be a very difficult narrative, especially to attract young people to support this. And we've seen, we've had a revolution in technology, and we've seen authoritarians with technology in their hands that they never had before, like what the surveillance we see in Xinjiang.
I think we've got a minute. Let me, again, try and angle a question as a devil's advocate here. And Sahar, China announced Thursday it was halving tariffs on some U.S. goods. Are countries likely to seek a resolution, perhaps on some of the trade disputes, global trade disagreements with the Trump administration, now that the impeachment process has ended with him apparently in a stronger position, according to the polls, and saying, well, he might be around for some time?
Well, I think that, like many of the other speakers have said, that with the impeachment finished and the process, there's more stability, there's more predictability. And so I think at least for the next 9 months, many of the foreign leaders are going to trust that Trump has the political backing and he has the security of position to make deals. But I'm not convinced that all of these foreign leaders believe that he is automatically going to win those elections. So those who think he may possibly lose in November may try to get as much out of him as they can, because if a Democrat wins, particularly because the Democrats are moving farther to the left in terms of the candidates, there is going to be a sea change in both domestic and foreign relations. And so depending on what authoritarians think is going to happen to Trump, those who think he has a much longer life span of another 4 years, that's going to affect their time frame. But I do want to just point out one important issue domestically. There is a silver lining in Trump's, what I think is Trump's authoritarian tendency and doctrine, is that there has been a backlash by young people and by liberals who have now become progressives and who are feeling that their democracy is threatened. And so we're seeing a lot of online activism, a lot of on-the-ground activism, and the Democratic Party is moving to the left and becoming more progressive. And I see that as an awakening of many kind of sleepy, couch voters or silent majority voters who are now waking up and saying, if we don't take action, we're going to lose our democracy. And it's not simply about Republican, Democrat. It's really about abuse of power, particularly coming out of the executive branch.
Let's see if they do indeed, those, as you put it, sleepy couch voters wake up, and where it leaves not only the US, the world. Elections are coming. Let's thank our guests so much, Sahar Aziz, Stanley, and Theresa Fallon. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, just head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.